So thank you, Peter. And with that, I will call up the first panel.
Oh.
Well, good morning, everybody. Can I check that microphone sound, how that's working? Can you hear me at the back? Am I sounding intelligent? I assume this is going through AI or something, and something is happening. Delighted to be here, delighted to have you all here. I know there are people in this group who have taken an interest in the Bennett Institute since its inception. Civil servants, members of civil society, students, think tanks, who have engaged with us and really contributed a great deal to the Institute and to our thinking. So it's just lovely to have you all here for another conference. I'm not sure what the collective noun is for a group of Cambridge professors. I'm going to go with an excitement of professors. If there are my students in the room, I'll ask you to keep quiet. The reason I call it an excitement is because it's an exciting panel that we have for you. Their biographies are in your booklet, so I won't go through them in depth, but Professor Laura Diaz Anadon next to me, Professor Shaila Jarfanel and Professor Gordon Harold, experts in climate change, in sustainability, development, food sustainability, and in mental health, and especially in the area of youth. And so the panel is centred around this term, wicked problems. You know, I first heard this term probably 15 years ago when public servants, would listen to me railing about how insoluble something like poverty is, and they would invariably look at me in this wise way, and they'd say, "Dennis, you know that's a wicked problem." And I didn't know. But since then, I've made it my business to try and find out. So just to give you a bit of context and scene setting on what wicked problems are. So they're typically complex, multifaceted, multi-layered problems that are really difficult to grip because of their overwhelming complexity. So the classic wicked problems are things like poverty or drug addiction or inequality, things that are never truly solved, but somehow have to be managed or tamed or responded to. And so the goal of this panel is to bring together experts on 3 different problems that have been labelled as wicked problems at different points in time, to see what we can make of that complexity and whether we can learn lessons from how we solve one of these problems in order to apply them to others. And, you know, the thematic consistency across the panel is to think we have a planet under strain, we have a food system and supply under strain, and we have people under strain. These are in and of themselves incredibly difficult, complex problems, but maybe there is something to learn from each other in how we might go about solving them. Okay, there'll be some questions from me and discussion from the panel for about half an hour, and then there will be a chance in the second half for questions from you. So as we go along, please do jot down your questions for a little bit later. That's a lot from me. Laura, let me perhaps start with you. Climate change is so hard to solve that some people in the literature have even called it a super wicked problem. It's a category all of its own. Do the characteristics of climate change make it absolutely unique as a problem? Or can we actually treat it the same way as we would any other wicked problem?
Thank you for inviting me, Dennis. And just since we have a very exciting panel of professors, I will start just by talking about wicked problems and its usefulness as a concept. So one thing, I also heard about wicked problems about 15 years ago when I started working on climate change. It's a term that dates back to 1973, the city planning literature, and there are these 10 characteristics that are supposed to be applying to things that are referred to as wicked problems. Other problems have been drug use, mental health, poverty, diseases. And when thinking about climate change as a wicked problem or super wicked problem, what strikes me is that one of the characteristics of wicked problems is that they're unique. So one of the characteristic number 7 of wicked problems is that they're unique. And I would say that climate change is unique in some ways to other complex or difficult problems, and that's how I like talking about climate change. But that doesn't mean that we cannot learn things across other problems. So what do we mean by climate change being unique? Well, as you said, it's a problem that has enormous interdependencies. There are uncertainties, circularities, there are conflicting stakeholders, so we have all of those things. We also have the time dimension. As we wait, things get worse in terms of emissions, so that is one of the characteristics of super wicked problems. But we can think about other problems, such as the rise of AI, for example, that also has this time dimension of super wicked problems. So what I would say is that over the past 15 years, as we have begun using this typology,
I think it's your hair brushing there.
As this typology from the planning literature moved on to other problems, we've also had the development of complexity science, which I think is actually very helpful trying to understand all of these interdependencies between, in the case of climate change, emission sectors, actors in society, and different governance levels. So what I would say is that rather than talking about climate change as a super wicked problem or a complex problem or a wicked problem, we should think about climate change as a problem that has all of these different actors, interdependencies, uncertainties, different levels of governance, and the challenge for policymakers and for academics is to think about how to break the problem and how to come up with the right evidence, the right analysis to inform decision makers at different points in time. And I think I'm out of time, but the last thing I will say is that we are actually already doing this in the big efforts such as the IPCC, the European Scientific Advisory Board on Climate Change, the UK Committee on Climate Change. We're taking this approach of breaking down the problem into sectors and cross-cutting issues to try to find a functional way to come up with solutions.
Laura, lovely, thank you. And that sort of breaking down into component parts is really interesting because I think we'll get into that in some of the other areas as well. Gordon, can I actually throw to you next? Because you've sort of spoken about the need for a collective multi-agency strategy for addressing mental health in young people. So you want to join up, education, general practice, social work, psychiatry, criminal justice, all these systems. Now, at one level, that sounds obviously hard, but perhaps not impossible. So what's stopping us?
Thank you, Dennis, and good morning, everybody. So let me start with a little bit of a scene setter to try to answer that question. It might be a slightly strange scene setter, but go with me. So I'm Irish. If anybody has visited Ireland and asked for directions in Ireland without a mobile phone, you might receive the advice, well, don't start from here. Go to the end of the street, start from there. It's closer to where you want to get to. Just think about that for a moment. So to answer your question, I would suggest we need a slightly different starting place to consider mental health as a so-called wicked problem. So when I'm asked to speak on the topic of mental health, typically in a policy context, I will politely respond by saying, so you would like me to speak about doing well? Oh, no, we want to talk about not doing well. So the different starting place is to recognize that mental health and mental ill health are not the same thing. And the strategies to enhance mental health, support mental health, versus intervene, interrupt, and redirect risk or expression of mental ill health require different strategies. In the first instance, simply understanding that is an important first step. So some statistics in terms of mental ill health. So mental ill health is now the leading cause of disability in the UK. 1 in 4 adults and young people in the UK experience serious mental health problems in a 12-month period. By 2030, depression will be the leading cause of what are referred to as disability-adjusted life years, time lost to illness, education, and employment. In a recent report, it's been estimated that mental ill health in the UK, costs of mental ill health in the UK exceed 300 billion annually. That's a big number. To contextualize that slightly, that's twice the annual budget of NHS England in 2022, and it's greater than the cost to UK economy of the COVID-19 pandemic. So think about mental ill health as equating to a pandemic every year. It concentrates the mind. 75% of serious psychiatric illness in adulthood is in place before the age of 18 years. So in order to understand, again, how we understand and treat mental ill health trajectory, we need to recognize that it's a lifespan problem. And if we don't recognize the problem before the age of 18 years, we're in a difficult place trying to support adults or people who are older than the age of 18 years, and the services that are required to address that problem. So aside from the factors that drive those rates and those problems, you say, what is the challenge in trying to address mental as a so-called wicked problem? So my experience, and it's my experience, is fundamentally an area of potential intervention is our disciplinary silos. So you mentioned multiple disciplines there, all of whom would have a direct interest in enhancing mental health and supporting mental ill health. But actually, we don't speak to each other a lot. We have common interest and we have casual conversation, but systematic, programmatic, interdisciplinary directed strategy we're poor at. If you scale from the academic or the research or the professional practice worlds to policy, those silos become even more intractable. So mental health, mental ill health, Department of Health Social Care, Department of Education, Department of Work and Pensions, Ministry of Justice would all have keen interest, but actually rarely programmatically communicate with each other around those topics of interest. Huge opportunity for the Bennett School of Public Policy to endeavor to broker that. Let me say mental health problems are going up. There's debate around is that increased reporting are actually going up. Mental health problems are going up. In 2023, there was a 22% increase in hospital self-harm admissions among 8 to 17-year-olds. And if we go out into anxiety, depression, other problems, mental health problems are going up. So the wicked problem is no longer endeavoring to understand why those problems are going. That is a wicked problem and must be taken and continue to be pursued in terms of inquiry. I would suggest the wicked problem is failing to address that challenge going forward.
Gordon, thank you. Gosh, there's some shocking statistics there which we may pick up on a little bit later. I mean, it's an interesting way to finish to say, actually, we are no longer in doubt that there is a problem. We're just not quite coming to grips with it. And I suspect that is something that is shared across the platform here in terms of the problems and the problem awareness. So Shailaja, if I come to you, if we think about a problem like food security, it's not new. And you've been involved in work exploring how to sort of scale up successful approaches to food sustainability. What are the barriers that stop that happening? What's the key to getting this done effectively, to scaling up those innovations?
Thank you very much. I'd like to begin with, so I'm trained as an economist, and I think the wicked problem narrative was very helpful in answering the question why economists have not been as successful as we would like. And the scalability problem is clearly one that requires us to cross disciplines. But I think economics can help in thinking about a typology of how one thinks about problems. So you have the type 1 problem, which is a technical problem. Dare I say an engineering solution, where you know what the problem is. You say, okay, I can fix this, I can get a widget or whatever the equivalent is in the modern technologies, and I can do that. A type 2 problem in relation to the wicked problem is, wicked problems are type 3, but the type 2 problem is one where you can define the problem easily, but you don't have a solution as well. And that's where we do things like randomized controlled trials, get evidence to try and go back to how one can design a solution. Now, as Laura says, the wicked problem has 10 component parts that you look at, but a type 3, and that's your wicked problem, is because not only is it not easy to find a technical fix, it is also non-definable because we don't have a prior, and so you need to look at feedback mechanisms, you need to bring in stakeholders, and fundamentally it's a framing problem. So if you like, it's a move from classical economics to Keynesian economics. You need to frame problems to be able to find solutions. And that's why I'm more hopeful than I would have been when I first encountered the wicked problem, because if everything's a wicked problem, then we should all go home. And government officials will say, basically, academics are useless. So I don't think economists have got it wrong, but we need to reconsider how the framing has moved. And so I'd like to give just one example in that regard, and that's to do with, in the food security space, the role and the controversy and the wicked problem around the genetic modified organism issue, the GMO. It's been around now for, at least 20 years in the policy space. The work on that, was much earlier. And the question I'm saying in terms of framing is, now everybody knows what a genetic modified organism is, and actually it's just another variety of hybrid. The difference is you're not splicing within species, you're growing cross species. That's a nice technical solution, but what did it do and what did it not do? So is the GMO about increasing food supply? Well, we've got enough food. We have the wrong kind of food. Is it about increasing yields? Is it about increasing trade possibilities in food, or all of the above? We still do not have a solution, and that's why we can't scale it up. So in the EU, we're afraid of it. We have a lot of regulation, but we don't use it, so we can't scale up. In the US, you've got it everywhere, but you're not regulating, so you have a health problem. So we don't agree. And if we reframe something like the GMO, that might be a way forward. And I'll say more about this later. But this is why poverty becomes the original wicked problem. Because taking the Victorian condition, is it the deserving poor or the undeserving poor? The idea was, over 100 years ago, the poor are responsible for their own plight. Whereas today, we would argue it's a structural condition. You are poor because you're in a community where there's not enough resources, and therefore poverty is not an attribute of the individual, but of the community in which you are. And therefore, we think about communities, and that's why the wicked problem was a planning solution. So I'll stop for the moment, but that's my starting comments. Thank you.
Shailaja, it's not a bad starting point. Framing and reframing problems is certainly something we will do in the next sort of half hour in front of us. So look, we labelled this session, Do Wicked Problems Need Wicked Solutions? The point of that really is to ask this question about ambition. Do we have the ambition required to actually tackle these problems? We have the ingenuity to place human beings on the moon, but we can't fix homelessness in Blackpool or in downtown London. Is that where we are? Can that be true? So, Gordon, let me pick on you. If I made you secretary tomorrow of the new Department of Government Ingenuity, with many, many resources at your disposal. I think there's warmth in the room for this idea, actually. That's good. How confident are you that we could dramatically improve mental health for young people in this country?
Very confident. Next question.
Could you
joke,
expand?
Yeah. And by the way, I like the title. I need to write that down, just bear that in mind for the future. That's a huge question, and let me, of course, my very confident might seem to be slightly trite. Let me reflect slightly. So, brilliant minds and very passionate personalities for decades have endeavored to take on that question. So I don't, for 1 second, want to underestimate the significance of the challenge, but also the opportunity. The fundamental difference in, if I may, Dennis, fundamental difference in landing on the moon or placing a person on the moon, or certainly placing on the moon, versus addressing homelessness in, I think you said Blackpool or London, other parts of the UK, or addressing young people's mental health, is financial investment. So I'm actually old enough to have, I don't remember it landing on the moon, I'm not that old, but I remember I was alive. So NASA would obviously be very, very well supported in the lead up to 1969 and since. Mental health is actually one of the least invested areas of health directed support than other areas of health and illness, and has been for decades. But from my statistics earlier, one of the most high need areas of investment. The current model of mental health support, mental ill health support and investment is, I would describe as a crisis-based model, a late intervention model. We don't wait, but those who work to try to support mental ill health typically deal with crisis-related challenges. Child and adolescent mental health services is beyond being on its knees. Adult mental health services, likewise, continuing to target solutions at a crisis through a crisis model is unsustainable. We know that early intervention prevention pays significant dividends at a cost level over time, but also at the individual and group levels. So debate rages about the causes of mental ill health, the good old nature versus nurture. We know they work together. Increasingly, the social determinants of mental illness is receiving more and more attention. We know, for example, that the big ticket items around placing a young person at risk for mental ill health, economic disadvantage, inequality, poverty. A report just yesterday and today you may have read, 4.5 million young people in the UK are now living in poverty. That's, again, a big number. What does that? How do you drill that down? On any given day in any classroom in the United Kingdom, 30% of children are living in poverty. That's simply not, I know it's not sustainable. That's a starting place to start the conversation. How do we support? Late intervention is just not viable. Economic disadvantage, parent mental health, domestic adversities, dynamics between adults, dynamics between parents and children, sibling peer influence, digital world increasingly identified, and trauma, event-based trauma, significant risks for mental health. And yet we have the science, we have the knowledge, we have the research, we have the evidence to know how we might intervene early. And by identifying those individuals who are at risk and having the conversation, it's okay to be recognized as being at risk. Penetrating stigma around mental ill health is a huge first step towards developing policies that might work for vulnerable groups. But we have the science that would allow us to move to a prevention-based model. And I would, in terms of wicked opportunity, that is a wicked opportunity. Move from intervention, late intervention and crisis, to early prevention and support.
And in terms of speed, is that a long-term program, as it were, so we have to wait for a generation to improve?
Yeah. So in the lifetime of rising mental health rates, it's a short-term opportunity. In the timescale for, in my experience, of a government department or policymaker, it's a very, very long time. So people who want change in 6 months, we're not dealing with that. But if I say that the biggest predictor of cross-generational adversity outcomes is experiencing adversity, so mental health and lived experience adversity are more likely to replicate across generations, where support is not provided, both those who experience problems, but those who are at risk of replicating those problems. So it's a short-term in the grand scheme of decades of rising rates, but we need to move the model away from intervening late to intervening early, but looking at a cross-generational framework to deliver those outcomes.
Gordon, thank you. Laura, let me talk to you about ambition and climate change. Have policymakers sort of simply become overwhelmed by the complexity of climate change? Do we actually need to build more complex solutions that are themselves as complex as climate change, or actually, sort of following on from your answer before, do we need to make it more pliable, more accessible for policymakers and the public to be able to champion it?
So climate is a difficult problem. And the reality is that we have evolved, both policymakers and academics, in trying to address the climate problem. While in 2009, it was not okay for economists to say we need something beyond a carbon price, we have learned a lot since, right? So we have already gone down the route of we don't have a silver bullet solution that will solve climate all over the world in every sector. So we're already going down that route. But I would say it's not going into more complex solutions just for the sake of it. It's because we have a much better understanding of some of these interconnections, interdependencies, uncertainties, as well as a much more explicit recognition that, as Shaila just said, we have a range of policy goals that have to be addressed and met along with climate. So I remember back in the 2010s, we had a lot of very reputable people saying, we need to do a carbon price or put a target, and it's a win-win-win. The economy will grow. Everybody will be better off. Now we do have the last 20 years of evidence on not just the impact of carbon pricing in different parts of the world, but also the impact of a lot of other policies that have been put in place to address climate change, regulatory and fiscal policies, things like tax credits, rebates, feed-in tariffs, renewable energy auctions. And we do see that depending on how these policies are created and designed and depending on where they are applied, there are, at least in the short term, winners and losers, right? So we have moved on in the academic, but also in the policy understanding. There are really very well-informed policymakers in the UK, in the EU, and beyond that are very aware of the fact that there are these side effects. In some cases, you can foresee them. In some cases, you can't. And that we need to learn from experience, learn from all of these different policies. So we've moved on from the discussion of climate change as a collective action problem. We need everybody around the world to reduce emissions, which of course we do, but a recognition that it's also a distributional politics and justice problem, whereby if you don't ex ante design policies accounting for what groups of people might lose jobs or what industries may be less competitive or who is going to suffer more from increased prices of different goods, then it's very hard to see a political coalition and sustained support for more ambitious, not targets. I mean, we have a lot of targets. Now, of course, the name of the game is implementation, right? What are the policies that different countries are putting in place to meet what are quite ambitious targets? I could talk about some of the things that we know have worked. So it's not all, it's just more complex. We have more policies where you need to do technology push, so R&D funding in particular ways to develop some of the technologies for areas where we don't have a solution. And again, one of them is, of course, decarbonizing aviation, which I know it's an area that a lot of people are working on in Cambridge. So it's the technology piece, but it's also the demand side. It's also looking at trying to catalyze behavioral changes, tipping points, making some technologies cheaper than others to enable a faster adoption of technologies to decarbonize industry, for example. So we have made some progress. When you think about emissions, we have decoupled partially, of course, economic growth and emissions. If we think about it globally, the global economy last year grew by 3%. Emissions only grew by 0.8%, but when you look at advanced economies, we actually went down. And even looking at consumption-based emissions on a continuous basis, over 18 countries have actually continuously reduced consumption-based emissions. So we are making some progress. We're learning about some of these tools, but clearly there's a lot more we can learn from within the climate and energy space, but also as inspired by this panel, across policy areas. And we've also done some work on what can we learn from agriculture, what can we learn from health, and things on policy instruments, what policy instruments can help reduce financing risk, increase accessibility. That's something where, again, I could also give examples of where we could learn from different policy spheres. So I think there's a lot of room for improvement, but there's a lot we can draw on.
There's sufficient understanding, if we can get the implementation right, to keep it moving forward. Let me ask perhaps one or two more questions, and then I'll come to the room. So start having your questions ready. But Shailaja, let me bring back in the citizen, the humble citizen, as a sort of co-creator, if you like, in solutions to public policy problems. You've written before about the importance of working with farmers and their local knowledge base in relation to food security. You know, how can we move from a sort of rigid top-down approach to some of these problems to that sort of more bottom-up flexibility? Is there a world in which citizens and governments can genuinely co-produce solutions to wicked problems?
So yeah, I think there are, and that is what is the reason to hope. So every time we have a killer statistic, we've got to think about why has that come to be. So the one that I worked with for the last 10 years is this fact that we keep talking about we want more food, but we're getting less biodiverse, and that's also affecting our ability to stay healthy, both physical and mental well-being. So close to 75% of all the food we eat across the world is 3 cereals, make up 75% of all cereal consumption. That's rice, wheat, and maize. Now, we also eat them in a very refined form, so that's really bad for us, and adult obesity is a definite challenge, and particularly in low to middle income countries, that's coming at a spike where we've got, therefore, the triple burden of malnutrition. So people who are much larger than they should be. Now, you can say, oh, this is a medical problem, why is a social scientist doing it? But as Laura said, there is a connection between our inability to work with the food producers, the farmers, and what we're eating. And that becomes a new type of wicked problem. Obesity or human-made diseases are going to be a new type of wicked problem. So here's the interesting part. Oftentimes, scientists, and I include social scientists, those of us in academic world, say, oh, we've discovered a new crop. No, we haven't. We found a crop someone's eating somewhere, and we need to work with that community. The classic case was quinoa, superfood, huge increase in incomes for South American farmers, and a collapse. Because we didn't understand what the supply chain was and what was happening. So the work that we did on the major project looking at sustainability of food for India, which is a large country, we discovered a group of cereals called millets. They're not one particular plant. They're not from the same species. They're basically small-seeded. Quinoa is like one of them, small-seeded shrubs, which because of the nature of the seed, work in your gut more slowly, have many more outer shells, and therefore breaks down carbs in a more complex way. Okay, we know about this. Where does the co-design come? Communities across the world have been eating forms of these. Okay, so in Mexico or West Africa, and that's where the maximum biodiversity is. So if we are truly interested in engaging governments and citizens, it's governments and citizens in those countries with us as academics, with governments and citizens here in the UK or elsewhere. It's trying to think about, we know biodiversity is important, it will generate incomes, it could create business, but most importantly, when you recognize someone as a co-partner, you're saying your knowledge is important. We're not going back to the Victorian problem of your problem is of your making. So what we think about in co-design is what are the communities out there, what are they producing? They're not going to produce if they're small farmers, particularly smallholders, the price is wrong. So maybe what we do as economists or others is think about how do we get over the problem of scalability. And the scalability problem then comes through in terms of how do we create marketing that doesn't have major spikes. So one of my solutions would be rather than thinking about just selling seeds, think about group crop insurance. That works over the 5-year cycle, which is the climate change cycle, which is entirely central to any small farm holder. And so thinking about collaboration and policy making has to be bottom up, not because it's against top down, because the knowledge lies in the community. This is equally true in the UK on the project that Laura and I are involved with, the Cambridge Landscape Regeneration, where in the Fens, which is not very far from where we are, the median income is far lower than the median income in the country or in the east of England. And so when you tell farmers there that, okay, we have to, and we do have to move towards net zero, what are they going to produce? They say, if you flood our farms, we can't grow vegetables, what are we going to grow? So working with farming communities, be it in the global north or global south, is also about the humility to understand that the knowledge base lies somewhere else. And all of us as academics are latecomers. And there are many gatekeepers and many players in that field. So long-term relationships over a generation would be the way to think. Now, that's going to be a challenge for funding research, but I genuinely believe without those kinds of initiatives, we're not going to be able to move towards wicked solutions.
Shailaja, thank you. Okay, let's take a few questions in the room. Can I ask you, when you have the microphone passed to you, and we have people running the microphones around for you, can you just state your name and your affiliation? And can you try and keep the question reasonably short? That would be appreciated. For those of our friends who are watching online, please do also put your questions in. They shall come to me seamlessly through the front of the room. So please do join in online. Okay, can I have hands up for some questions, please? Goodness, okay. let me go by block over this. So, yes, right next to the microphone. Thank you.
Hi, good morning. I'm Arlene Holmes-Henderson. I'm Professor of Classics and Public Policy at Durham University. I'm going to be a bit provocative. We've heard a lot about science and social science, data and statistics. Do we need arts and humanities scholars to take the lead in finding solutions to wicked problems?
Well, Arlene, that is provocative. Who shall I direct that one to? Gordon, give me a nod. It's over to you.
Arlene, thank you for that question. The answer is not yes, arts humanities can take the lead, but arts humanities can be very much part of the disciplinary profile that is needed. We need an entire rebooting of the approach. I'm speaking specifically around mental health, but I would offer similar opportunities to my colleagues. Disciplines can ask and address particular questions, and can bring methodologies that can address particular questions. So where we can find common ground is to have a question we're collectively interested in. We then take our respective approaches to try to enhance our understanding of that particular question. So the answer is absolutely yes. And I certainly, and again, I speak for my colleagues, in no way intended to suggest art humanities were not part of that story, but absolutely very much part of a collective community towards that, our particular objectives around wicked problems.
I just completely agree. I will just add that I think in climate we have seen a growing number of disciplines over time playing a role. If you look at the different IPCC reports, you look at the AR4, the fourth one in the late 2000s, and the most recent one, which for the mitigation chapter was published in 2022, you went from having just a couple of disciplines to then having sociologists and anthropologists and behavioral scientists. And I think what you will see if you look at the outline for the next assessment report, the seventh one, is that the range of topics in the outline that will be discussed is much broader. And I would hope that in the selection of authors, there is a much bigger or some representation for sure of arts and humanities, because we do need that perspective to, because clear what we're doing right now is not enough. And so completely agree, but I think we're moving in that direction, which is a great one.
Yeah, just to follow that up, I mean, I think without the arts and humanities, we wouldn't be able to work with communities or communities to understand us. So in the millet story, lots of communities in West Africa, for example, they've stopped growing millets or eating it, and they've moved to rice because it's more popular, it's got a higher price. But you ask people, oh, you don't eat millets, and then you have the conference, and then you sit and you talk and say, so when you have a special event, what do you eat? And they'll tell you about these recipes. And you say, what's in it? And invariably one will have millet. They've just forgotten about it. So we're collecting recipes and talking to grandmothers and how were they cooked. And that's what brings the community together. And just before COVID, we had a fair in Caneba in West Africa where we worked with the MRC to say who could cook these things. So it was like young people coming in, the young people being central. And they were like, nobody ever said our foods were interesting, you know. So absolutely, without that human element, the other stuff is not going to work.
I think you've swung the entire panel your way, Arlene. Questions in the middle. Right in the middle. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Esme. I want to pick up on Shailaja, one of your points a minute ago about co-creating knowledge. I was reading a bit of report from the Institute for Environmental Sciences this morning that was talking about needing to take account of alternative worldviews and alternative ways of knowing, but was reflecting back on a point that struck me in one of these conferences a few years ago, where I think it was the sort of placemaking panel on the back of the Townscapes report. A really senior civil servant was having the debate with the rest of us about how do we have to do everything in kind of an understanding of local places? Surely that's impossible to do. So I'm just really wondering where you see the possibilities to shift in government, to shift to a real acceptance of the need for co-creating in local places, and what we can do, what your ask of us as an audience is to do to try and support that ambition.
Please.
That's a really important question, and I think, yes, there is a danger when we talk about, is it co-creation, is it co-design, is it co-implementation? These are all part of process-based analyses, and I think the reframing in terms of wicked problems has to be on process. And where there is a gap, the community identifies. So it's not for us to go and say, oh, we want to map you, which is, bad ethnography if you do it that way, and I don't think most of us would. But the point is, you're saying, how do you see your world? So it's the classic Socratic, what is the good life? What do you value? What do you fear? For them to talk about those aspects of their lives. And as you said, I mean, they think it's bizarre as disciplines that we've got silos, because their lives don't operate in disciplinary divides. They go very quickly between those spaces. And so the reason this work is necessary is because maybe an RCT doesn't show you the result. You do qualitative because it's much richer, it gives you much greater insight, and then you are able to understand what's the first step that you have to take into an intervention. That has to be co-designed with them. So it's not that, oh, they didn't know their values. It's for them. They're doing it for us to translate their lives into that translation space for us to know how we begin to co-design an intervention. And so absolutely not. I don't think you're going to say, oh, we're doing this. You didn't know what your place is like. We're saying you have recognized a gap. And that's why invariably, place-based agendas work with left-behind areas or other kinds of features. In places where they don't need us, we go in, we operate more as citizens and try and enjoy those spaces. So I think it's really important to understand when we create a framing such as place-based agendas, what it's being done for. And that's why I gave the GMO example. Wicked problems continue because we can keep collecting information, but information is not design. And so we've got to get to that stage.
Thank you, excellent. Let me take one from this side of the room, halfway down.
Ben Martin, Churchill graduate, Professor of Science Policy, and Peter Bennett's brother-in-law. I'd like to pick up on some of the things that Professors Anadon and Fennell were hinting at, and indeed the Professor of Classics perhaps was trying to get at. What can we learn from historical examples of wicked problems? We didn't call them that, but they certainly were wicked. If we think in terms of environment and climate, we had the ozone problem a few years back. We had all the problems of the Industrial Revolution in terms of pollution of rivers and the air. I'm old enough to remember smogs and things like that. We had the Dust Bowl in the US and the policies to try and accommodate that. I'm old enough to remember poverty and starvation in the 60s and the documentaries of the children with distended stomachs. We had the Green Revolution. So sometimes we solve these problems, other times we didn't. In the health area, we've had what we would now call wicked problems. COVID is the most recent one. Before COVID, we thought it took 10 to 20 years to come up with a new vaccine or drug. Come COVID, we did it in a year. So what can we learn from that? We've had other health problems that we've overcome, which might have seemed wicked at the time if we'd used that terminology. So what can we learn from these historical examples for today's wicked problems?
Ben, thank you. Now, would you like to go first on environmental?
I'll start very briefly. I think the first example you mentioned, Ben, was the Montreal Protocol and how we managed to come up with a global agreement, a binding one, with an architecture that really allowed us to now be in a path to solving the problem in a few decades. So that is an example. In fact, it has been characterized as the most successful international environmental agreement of all time. And I think there are some things we can and have learned from the Montreal Protocol as it applies to climate change. So some of the components, not all of them, and I know we have other experts in the room here on international environmental law, some things we have learned from. So some of the, having the, some financing was copying the multilateral fund that was created under the Montreal Protocol, where funding from industrialized countries was going to low-income and developing countries to, at a later stage, reduce emissions. So some things we have, so targets, we have funding, we have, but then there are differences, right? I talked about, and the wicked problem typology itself talks about how every wicked problem is unique. So while some aspects we are learning from, in climate, for example, we have a much bigger set of technologies that are needed, a much bigger set of actors involved, so the users or the adopters of those technologies to remove CFCs and replace them with HFCs, which then had climate impacts themselves, but that was industry, right? It was industry that had to adopt this, so it was a much smaller set of actors in a much more disconnected part of the economy. So I think it's not a surprise that when we talk about climate, just going for the international sphere is not something that can work. And in fact, where we have seen the majority of the action, the majority of the successes in terms of technologies deployed, costs coming down, emissions in some sectors really improving, has been through action at the national level, which again, talking about the analogs that you mentioned, well, that's the sort of action that did manage to solve problems with smog in the US, right? The Sonora, Pennsylvania event in the mid-50s basically led to the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency in the US to address this. So I think there's a lot to learn from, and I think some of these examples are examples that we have already learned from, but certainly I'm not aware of the sort of Bible on how can we learn from all of these events, and it would be an interesting thing to pursue.
Both of you, let's go in order. Zara, and then...
So I'm going to pick up on the Green Revolution story and say that wasn't the first one, but it was a very significant one because it allowed us to feed very many hungry people. It was absolutely necessary. India had 3 months food supply, PL 480. Green Revolution's a far better solution in terms of thinking about hungry people. But what we learned from that is technical solutions reach a plateau because you are doing them, they run out. And we cannot necessarily think, and that was interesting with GMO, would it be another green revolution? It was a different kind of technology, it had a different kind of solution. And so that was my plea for thinking about the process-based. What problem are you solving? Frame it, rather than a normative base, which says it's a technological solution. Don't be quick to create definitions, because oftentimes they preclude the possibility of having a more insightful approach. So historically, let's go back. Let's go back to the fact that in the 1870s, as you said, in the UK, at the height of the Industrial Revolution, we had huge problems in terms of inequality of access. And it was only after the First World War, in some ways maybe because of the 2 wars, that we created social policy. And I'm not making the claim that we need another war. I'm making the claim that we need to be able to find things to prevent that kind of collapse. And that is why we need long-term projects, so you have a baseline and you can look through. And that's where you track your processes, because they don't take place in 6 months. Sometimes it is intergenerational. The feature that we found today, when you look at communities adopting new technologies, biodiversity or agroecology, they're the ones that are 2 generations hand-holding by some agency, be it an international agency or a local faith-based agency. You need to understand social trust, and we're going to have a talk later about disinformation, how it breaks down social trust. So as an economist, we are doing social network analysis. Some people are doing machine learning, big data sets, small data sets, understanding how trust is built. And of course, the flip side, how easy it is to destroy trust. And so we really need to be careful on both accounts, and we need to share that knowledge across different disciplines.
Gordon, did you want to come in on
Yeah,
history?
very brief response. I think it's an excellent question. So you hear the word history, and by default, we step back decades or indeed centuries. And actually, you mentioned COVID. As a developmental psychologist, as a prevention scientist, well, I would never wish COVID to happen again. Actually, what COVID did was fundamentally change systems in a way that required those systems to respond to societal needs. So if we go pre-COVID, and I said to you, in the next month, we're going to have everybody who walks out in the public wear a face mask, and everybody must be 2 meters apart from each other. And I'm going to speak to a relevant government office to encourage that. Not a chance. And the answer would be, well, that's the whole population. That requires multiple government departments to get together. That's just simply not going to happen. So that event happened. Those changes were required. Sir Patrick Vallance, Chris Wheaty, Jonathan Van Tam, other key players in that space asked the question, well, why are government departments not speaking to each other? And it's not a question of, let's get together and have a polite conversation about it. You have to do that. I don't want to be impositional or dictatorial, but the objective is such that actually this required what's in the world of prevention science, a universal prevention intervention. Everybody had to be connected with information, evidence-based information, to change behavior. That's a universal prevention intervention. The evidence has to be robust. That's down to the researchers, the scientists, and all relevant disciplines. And really importantly, it has to be communicated effectively. So Sir John Aston and the various groups that actually said, how do you take significant values, 0.0005? John must say he'd appear on the front page of The Sun, one of his biggest successes. Actually getting it onto the front page of The Sun robustly in terms of content, but communicating to communities. That's a universal prevention intervention, preventative. Now, we take mental health. I don't want to speak for climate or poverty. They are wicked problems. But actually, to your question, are you confident about change? Yes, I am very confident, because now we have an example that I can point to a politician. There's a universal preventative intervention for you. Let's do that again.
Excellent, thank you. Let's fire through a couple of questions from that have come in from online. How can AI aid government to tackle wicked problems? We're all waiting for AI to solve our problems. Is it workable in any of your areas? Are you waiting for AI? Who would like to answer?
So the session last year, I had an expert in AI and used the phrase, not just artificial intelligence, but augmented intelligence. So I'm borrowing that phrase. There's no question that AI offers huge potential. Huge, full stop. When implemented in a way that meets need, and importantly brings communities, populations, and groups with that change. Huge potential. The mechanics and how, etc., remains to be figured out. But again, to use the COVID response example, we now have evidence of system-level change potential and the mechanics of system-level change and the implementation, the evaluation of that change that offers immense opportunity to wider society.
I think AI, in terms of climate, it's already being helpful or useful in many ways. So in research itself, a lot of climate research is already drawing on machine learning techniques to try to identify cause and effect, to try to see of all of these different, hundreds of interventions that we've had, can we, using machine learning, extracting data from LinkedIn, from social media, what is it that we can see? So it can help us identify, find effective interventions for different possible metrics of effectiveness. AI can also help with some of the more network-related challenges of energy and industrialization. So in terms of what efficiencies that industry is able to find, how to do process heat integration, how to do logistics. So there's a lot of things like that in terms of the deployment of AI that can help increase energy efficiency, right? And that reduces emissions. On the other hand, we also have a few negative impacts of AI. So again, it's all on what you use it for, right? So if you use it to reduce energy intensity, if you use it to find effective interventions, all great. But right now, what we see, just looking at the data that the International Energy Agency released just a couple of weeks ago, we do see that electricity demand globally has increased, and that is something that is positive in the sense that it's the easiest sector to decarbonize. So if we decarbonize electricity and we electrify more uses, that's good for climate, right? But what we're seeing is that the increase, the electricity demand with surge by 4.3% from last year, it was driven by three things. One of them, perhaps, again, it's very hard to exactly quantify, but one of the big ones was digitalization. As we all know, the really much larger use of electricity needed for data centers to power things like AI, as well as, interestingly, higher temperatures that result in higher heating needs. So climate change itself is increasing the need for electricity demand. So that's one possible impact of the use of AI, that if it's not managed carefully, can, of course, make it more difficult to solve the problem, because while we don't fully decarbonize, then increasing electricity demand can also lead to increased emissions. And then, of course, I had two pluses and two minuses. The second big impact of AI is, of course, that if it's not managed properly and you end up having even greater increase in inequality and disempowerment of different communities, then obviously any other collective action or social goal becomes more difficult, right? Because in a democratic society, if you have people that feel like, well, now they have no jobs or they have no voice, then why are they going to support action on some of these environmental issues?
Excellent point.
And I think just Ben's point about history, the same things happened before. We've had technologies, we've had challenges with it. In relation to thinking about how does one think about agriculture and biodiversity simultaneously, we need multi-scalar solutions for which we need multi-layered data. And actually, if you think about that, what communities value, you start putting that value data within this story, you get really detailed ability to think about this, which makes it possible to train on that data and to use that data so we do it prior as a preventive rather than as pushing people out. So it's actually understanding that human potential and human creativity is there. And maybe when we think about RCTs or the equivalent going forward, we are evaluating not interventions, but thinking through value-based systems. So you do that first, put in the values, run more complex experiments, which will give you better results. And I think that will definitely engage with this fundamental challenge that we have. The richest biodiversity is in the poorest countries. How do we harness that for human beings, but in a planet sustainability paradigm?
Beautifully put. AI, not an alternative to human values, but let's train it well and make it useful. Let me combine these two questions that will come back to the room. So these essentially political questions. So the current fractured geopolitical situation, what does that mean for the tractability of wicked problems? And frankly, are democratic electoral cycles too short anyway, even if they're working well, for us to be able to tackle these kind of things? What do we think on this?
I think it's a question for the Bennett School of Public Policy.
We can say a couple of things.
But
Give them a hint. Yeah.
I mean, it'll sound like I'm naive in my response. My 18-year-old son sat down with me the day before yesterday and said, do we need to worry about our older son, Keith, who's living in Arizona, because he's very concerned about the Trump landscape and various things. And I said, yeah, we probably do need to worry about Keith, our oldest son. But I said, what is your worry? And he said, my worry is that I don't know what I can believe in terms of risk. And I said, that's a great question. But if the risk is real, again, using the COVID example, we do need to take that seriously. And we don't really have the time to debate from the various perspectives of what might be explaining the source and origins and mechanisms around that risk. There's a significant risk. We have knowledge, we have evidence, we have examples that we can implement, trial, evaluate, and indeed scale, and then move across other problems. So forgive me for saying this, it's a period of immense opportunity because we have to change how we go about dealing with wicked problems.
Thank you.
I'll just, so on the geopolitical landscape, that's something that it's also very relevant for climate, obviously. On the one hand, over the past 20, 30 years, some of the biggest successes in climate and energy have been partly enabled through trade and policy. So you've seen really fast cost reductions in a lot of key technologies for decarbonization, from solar panels to offshore wind, lithium-ion batteries, solid-state lighting. So they were these cost reductions that have made possible some of these improvements we've made. They were enabled by policies, but also by global trade, right? We've had a lot of the manufacturing for a lot of these technologies in China. So on the one hand, one of the things that makes it possible to make some progress has been enabled by trade. On the other hand, now we're in a situation in which, with increased trade restrictions and also some of the impacts on energy prices and gas prices and oil prices, it also means that there are other opportunities, as Gordon said, in terms of using the decarbonization of the economy to also mitigate risk against natural gas prices. So when you think about what would it mean for Europe to meet its different European countries, including the UK, meet 2030 targets for renewable energy? Well, when you consider all of the different uncertainties, uncertainty around natural gas prices, weather, and electricity demand, what you see is that a greater penetration of renewables actually stabilizes power prices. So you have an additional or a co-benefit of climate mitigation at the domestic level. So in addition to the economic security and energy security benefits, which have impacts on low-income individuals, who are the ones who are facing also the volatile and high power prices, we also have an increased interest in the competitiveness and growth agenda. So we all know about the Mario Draghi report for industrial policy in the European Union. And there is a growing interest from countries to say, well, what is the right level of exports and imports in different energy technologies and energy materials? And that aligns well with something that we know people care about, which is, of course, jobs and economic opportunity. So in a sense, this increased risk from not being able to get the materials or the components of the technologies that we know we need kind of aligns well with saying we're going to invest in some level of domestic manufacturing and domestic jobs in areas where we may be able to be competitive from a UK perspective, but also from the perspective of other countries. So this, again, presents an opportunity for these additional co-benefits that we know people support and care about, and rightly so.
Mm-hmm. Economic security doesn't mean less trade. Economic security means understanding national portfolios. If you think about countries' biodiversity as a form of portfolio management, how do you manage your various assets and how do you draw down? This is also a time then for us to reconsider how we create exchanges, be that knowledge-based exchange or research-based exchange, which then allowed us to reconsider what kinds of trade flows would occur at a time when we're saying, oh, it's 25% steel. That again reminds me of the 1880s. That's when the US had 25% steel imports. But what we're thinking about is, why do we have assets and how do we draw them down? And so if countries are trying to think about this in terms of managing their portfolio, you come up with more creative solutions. We had a short version of that, not in the agricultural space, but in the critical mineral sustainability space, thinking about Quad. So you can reconsider who your players are, where you want to be, particularly if you're in the middle of a supply chain in agriculture. You have much greater linkages upwards and downwards, going back to Albert Hirschman. So some of the ideas that we have in thinking and arguing what we knew in the 20th century, which is a long 20th century, would help us in the 21st. And so economic security can lead to resilience, which happens to be the title of my professorship. Maybe that's why I'm saying that. But I think we can only be resilient if we reconsider economic security as a paradigm rather than a singular point, which means nationalism, which is where the problem rises.
Excellent. Goodness me, there's a clock up there, and that clock is warning me that I'm actually about to wind this up. So I know there are many questions still in the room, but let me finish with a question to the panel, which is, to what extent do governments in particular like single big ideas because they're very saleable to the public? So I'm going to betray my Australian bias. So Australia at the moment, Laura, the opposition in Australia in the election that's about to happen, their big policy is to bring in nuclear power, massive nuclear power across the country in order to reduce the climate footprint, because it's one big idea. If we think about I think, Gordon, we were speaking in the green room about Australia's ban on social media for under 16s as here is a one-shot solution. I can fix teenage mental health. This is how I'm going to do it. And I think GMO at different points has probably been seen the same way, Shailaja. So that's a very long-winded question. Are governments too attracted to one big idea in each of your areas? Should they be thinking differently and quickly? Gordon, I'll start with you.
Okay, so I'd be very quick. So I think if you can give the government the big idea, or the relevant policy office the big idea, and guide and direct how they then pursue addressing that big idea, then I think we can make significant inroads. Your point about social media, there's a huge debate around social media. The evidence is still relatively out, the jury is out in terms of actually, is it bad, is it not bad? Evidence suggests that content, time, etc., is not good for young people. Anyone who watched, I wouldn't ordinarily point at a TV program as a place to go and get your evidence, but the adolescent series recently it really speaks to that. But there's a key part of that, if I can take just less than 60 seconds, key part of that, which was a young person talking about his experience of his dad at a football match. And in the end, sorry if you haven't seen it, I'm spoiling it. And in the last episode, the father reflecting on, completely independently, his experience of that young person's experience at that football match. And it was all built around the young person's ability to play football. The opportunity was actually for the father and the young person just to communicate. And the question being asked by the father through his account of that experience was, how could I have done that differently? Now, if you can communicate to government, we need to get past just awareness raising around mental health and mental ill health to actually really focusing in on the causes and how we generate public understanding and guidance around the causes. I think you're onto a big idea that might make some significant difference.
Thank you. Shailaja?
So I think governments are most interested in staying in power. So if we think of a democratic process, they'd like to be voted in. And I think the ability in the academic space to give them an idea early on, I'm not saying anything about the current government, we've got a new government, but any government early on and say, you're thinking about this, this is what you need to do not to fail, is a way that you can get an in. So if you're saying, okay, you want to have, actually think of net zero, these are the two options you've got, this is going to cost this much, the other way costs another one, that's one way. Another way to say is, you can collect this information and it will help you win the next election. You're increasing their time frame and reducing their discount rate. And that's something I learned where, we did a project and we thought we did a good project, that was a DFID in the old days, and the minister in Ghana, woman minister, just said, I completely agree, I have 2 minutes, you've got to give me 2 lines that I can stand up and say. So it's also a challenge for us as academics, we have lots of good ideas, how do we then put it in a way, because this minister believes us, but she's got to sell it to her cabinet colleagues. So that's a challenge for us and for the Bennett Institute.
So I think in climate, you need a lot of big ideas, right? You cannot just solve it with nuclear, even if that was the solution in a particular context. But I agree, sometimes it's easy for policymakers, regardless of the country, to be told this is what it's going to be. And if you do this, it's going to work. So what is the challenge? You have to have the right idea, a policy entrepreneur, and the window of opportunity, where you maybe have this change in government or the new person. And sometimes these things don't align. But there's an even bigger challenge, which is that even when you think you have the right policy or the right set of policies, it doesn't always have the salience for voters or for different groups that you think. So the example here is the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, right? So in the US, they went for the let's do carrots, not sticks, to decarbonize society. So instead of passing a cap and trade or a carbon tax, which doesn't pass through Congress over there, let's subsidize clean tech production, and obviously this is going to create jobs and it's going to create deployment, which it did, right? But it didn't get them the White House, right? A lot of things were happening, but I think one of the challenges is that even when you think you have the right idea and maybe there's even the right moment, there are landscape pressures and landscape events that happen. It's very hard to forecast and say ahead of time exactly how things are going to play out. So I think it's there are various things that make it difficult, but I absolutely agree that whenever you talk to people in policy, they often, not always, as I said, they're really very knowledgeable people, it's easier to communicate one thing.
Excellent, thank you so much. Before I ask you to join me in thanking the panel, to just set out the time frame. So we are back in here at 11:45, 11:45 for the next session. So you'll have half an hour out there for tea and coffee and convivial conversation. Before that happens, can I ask you please to join me in thanking our excellent panel.